Hello everyone, it's Jamarl Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, I hope everyone is doing all right this morning. This video is going to be a little different. This is going to be somewhat of a historical context. I've been reading Chalmers Johnson's book, Nemesis, and Blowback. I suggest both books, but definitely the book Nemesis. By the way, before I start, if you enjoy the content and you find yourself coming back here often, please feel free to share, like, subscribe, and you can always support this content through Patreon. I have been demonetized magnificently, and any support that you give to the channel at this point is beneficial and helps, whether it's Patreon or PayPal or for the matter super chats. So let's get back to the thing. So I wanted to read a section of this book. I suggest the entirety of the book, but there's sections of this book that are awesome. Now, speaking from the standpoint of me doing a previous video on Kissinger being essentially humiliated and shamed, I want to go further into this idea of some of the history of the CIA and some of the attempts to restrain the behavior of the CIA. Those attempts failed. This idea of accountability failed, even when they tried to make a connection saying that the CIA's actions need to be tethered to some kind of policy. Failed. They wanted accountability or unaccountability, wanted to be built into the process, because they wanted to be able to deny any of the actions that the CIA takes. Meaning, yes, this particular action happened. No, we have no paper trail to say that who did what. And everybody denies everything. It's fucking phenomenally fascinating. So I'm going to read a history of this in the context of Chile. This is Chalmers Johnson's, and I'll try to make it quick, and I'll try to go through it fast, because I know the reading thing becomes a bit much. But this is his book, Nemesis. In both of his books, he has a few books, but in his books he's making the argument that it is absolutely foreseeable that countries that we have harmed and done bad things to around the world, that there may be blowback, there may be consequences for our actions, and that we can't necessarily react as children, shocked that other countries are perturbed by the actions that we take, especially when those actions are deleterious to the countries in question. In this very specific case, I'm talking about Chile. He makes this argument in Blowback that when we were hit on 9/11, we had no idea who hit us on 9/11, because we had been involved in all sorts of clandestine operations all across the world, in Guatemala, in Chile, in Nicaragua, in Iran, all across the world, destabilizing and toppling governments. And any of those people would have had just cause to be pissed and angry and attack us for it. Mind you, it ended up being Saudis, people who were supposedly in a close relationship with them, who just had a guy murdered. But fact is, we didn't know, because fact is, we've been fucking over people all across the world. This is Chalmers Johnson's book, Nemesis. And it's only going to be a section. CIA covert operations are distinguished from military assaults carried out by the Department of Defense, which is also rapidly expanding in covert operations. This was written during the Bush administration. So, and unfortunately, Johnson is no longer with us, but you can see his lectures online where he's in this kind of interviews, and his interviews are amazing. I suggest the interviews also as required listening. They're really good. Chiefly by the requirements that the president must be, let's start from the beginning. CIA covert operations are distinguished from military assaults carried out by the Department of Defense, which is also rapidly expanding its covert operations, chiefly by the requirement that the president must be able to plausibly deny that he ordered them or that he even knew about them. Covert operations are therefore protected by the most rigorous secrecy. As Locke Johnson observes, this sort of secrecy also destroys the last shreds of agency accountability. Under a system of plausible denial, it often becomes uncertain who really does know about and has approved any given covert action. The lines of accountability wash away like markings in the sand. An action takes place. Somebody tries to overthrow a government. Who gave the order? We don't know. We have no idea. There's no accountability in the process because plausible deniability is built into the political process. That's fascinating. Like, I read that and thought, oh my God. Now, the thing is, Congress actually tried to do its job on this and tried to restrain. So here we are. From the creation of the CIA in 1947 down to the Hughes-Ryan Act of 1974, there were virtually no officials of government who actually supervised or gave approval for covert actions or knew in detail about them or what they were supposed to accomplish. The foreign policy establishment in Washington trusted the CIA, Thomas Powers wrote in 1979, and still trusted for that matter. But beyond governing circles, the political foundations of the CIA rest on nothing more than substantial than a popular fascination with espionage and a conviction that they are the good guys. The Church Committee estimates that the National Security Council itself knew about and approved of no more than 14% of all covert actions from 1961 to 1975. Think about what's being said. The Church Committee estimated that the National Security Council itself knew about and approved no more than 14% of all covert actions from 1961 to 1975. Meaning the toppling of governments, the disruption, the killings, the destabilizations were unsupervised. The CIA had this thing in them saying we're the good guys and what we're doing, regardless of the bad, nasty things that we're doing. And accountability wasn't a part of the process. Because at the end of the day, the president needed to be able to say, I had no idea that they were doing that, in order for the CIA to operate in the way that it operated. For example, when it came to investigating the CIA's several attempts to assassinate President Fidel Castro of Cuba and a few other heads of state, the Church Committee had to throw in the towel. Numerous cabinet officials, including Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, testified under oath that it was unthinkable that either Presidents Eisenhower or Kennedy had authorized the mission. As Powers writes, the committee was forced to confess in the end that while it had no evidence that the CIA had been a rogue elephant rampaging out of control, it also had no evidence that Eisenhower or Kennedy or anyone else speaking in one of their names had ordered the CIA to kill Castro. Do you hear what's being said here? This is phenomenal. I read this and I thought, oh my God. Plausible denial, extreme secrecy, the power of the presidency, and the culture of loyalty to the agency rather than to the Constitution caused this kind of endemic confusion, exceedingly useful to those in power who is responsible for what the CIA does, a problem that still haunts the government today. That's a phenomenal thing. I mean, ultimately, there's no accountability. That even though they couldn't prove that the CIA was essentially going about its way without any kind of direct order, there was no way to determine who gave the order. So yes, the CIA was trying to murder Castro, but no, they couldn't necessarily make a direct link between the presidents trying to order that, even though there was no evidence that the CIA was acting on its own. That's fucking phenomenal. Like, let's keep going, because it gets more. The 1974 Hughes-Ryan Act, named after its author, Senator Harold Hughes, Democrat from Iowa, and Representative Leo Ryan, Democrat from California, for the first time tried to enforce the CIA's accountability to elected representatives of the people. It states that no funds may be expended by or behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency for operations in foreign countries unless and until the president finds that each such operation is important to the national security of the United States. Understand what they're trying to do. They were trying to create accountability. They were trying to say look, if the CIA is taking operations, it needs to be tethered to something that the president is telling them to do. Meaning, if they do something, at the very least, you can hold somebody accountable for something that they do. That's fucking phenomenal. The verb finds, quote unquote, is the origin of the odd term finding, which is the government argot for the document that the president now signs approving and setting in motion a covert operation. The law also stipulates that the president must give the appropriate committees of Congress in a timely fashion a description of each operation and its scope. The law has not worked well. In the middle of the Reagan administration, members of Congress first read in newspapers that an order of the president's national security advisor, Vice Admiral John Poindexter, CIA operatives were covertly and illegally selling arms to the revolutionary government of Iran and urging funds thus obtained to finance congressional forbidden insurgencies against the elected governments of Nicaragua. This disaster led to much stronger demands for intelligence oversight, but the president and his secret army found numerous ways to get around such pressures. Right here, let's jump down. CIA activities in Chile, ranging from the early 1960s to 1990s, occurred in both pre- and post-accountability eras. Before 1974, they were intended to overthrow the oldest, most stable democracy in Latin America, dating from the country's independence in 1818, and replace it with the valets of Latin American dictators in recent history. Having to report to Congress had little effect on the CIA operations in Chile. If findings were ever signed and passed into Capitol Hill, we have no record of them. What we do have is a vast archive of thousands of highly classified reports and cables from the Oval Office, the CIA, the National Security Council, the State Department, the American Embassy in Santiago, the FBI, the United States government was forced to declassify because of blowback that operatives themselves generated, including lawsuits by Chilean torture victims and demands for the arrest and trial of former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. The person who you're seeing is Allende. He won the election, but the CIA, working under the orders of the presidents, were against him. And we're going to get to this. Chile was certainly not the first instance in which the United States government uses clandestine services to manipulate, undermine, or overthrow a fellow democracy. It had done so in many other places, including in Italy in 1974 to 48. 47 to 48, Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, Indonesia in 1957 to 58, Brazil from 1961 to 1964, Greece from 1964 to 1974, South Korea from 1961 to 1987, and the Philippines in every year since it gained its independence from the United States in 1946. But Chile provides us with the first written record of the United States president ordering the overthrow of a democratically elected government, namely the handwritten notes of the CIA director Richard Helms, reflecting the orders given to him by President Richard Nixon in the White House on September 15, 1970. Even the heavily censored CIA documents released to the Church Committee in 1975 led Senator Church to produce his own definition of covert action. It is the semantic disguise for murder, coercion, blackmail, bribery, the spreading of lies, and the consorting with known torturers and international terrorists. That is profound. All of this is true. None of this is even in question. All of these are flat facts. These are things that we were doing around the world. And in this case, working to destabilize other democracies. In this very specific case, Chile. From the moment the Kennedy administration came to power in 1961 until the overthrow and death of Chile's President Salvador Allende on September 11, 1973, the CIA spent some $12 million on a massive black propaganda campaign to support Allende's primary political opponent, Eduardo Frei, the candidate of the Christian Democratic Party, and so to denigrate Allende as a stooge of the Soviet Union. In addition, the international telephone and telegraph corporations, which owned the Chilean telephone system, and other American-owned businesses in Chile gave the CIA an extra $1.5 million to help discredit Allende. The capitalist class was essentially giving money to work with the CIA in order to stop a political opponent from getting into office. This is profound and amazing. Now, again, this is not even something that's mind-blowing, at least from people who pay attention to this stuff. But there may be some people who think that the United States spreads love and light all throughout the world and would be shocked to hear that, oh my God, that's not necessarily true. We were overthrowing democratically elected governments, making the argument that this guy was some kind of stooge of the Soviet Union. He was not. He was not. Chilean telephone system, an extra $1.5 million to help discredit Allende's. ITT, I don't think they're around anymore. ITT properties in Chile, including 2 Sheraton hotels, were worth $153 million. In July 1970, 2 months before Allende was elected president, John McCone, director of the Central Intelligence from 1961 to 1665, and in 1970, a member of the board of ITT, set up an appointment with the DCI Richard Helms. He offered money and cooperation from ITT for the purpose of assisting the United States government plan to stop Allende. The capitalist class was working with the CIA to stop Allende. Is this really what you want your government doing? This is amazing. He offered money and cooperation from ITT for the purposes of assisting any government plan to stop Allende. ITT presented a plan aimed at inducing economic collapse in Chile. Now, within the context of this, a historical context, look at Nicaragua. Look at Venezuela. The goal of the capitalist class in this case was to induce an economic collapse in Chile because they didn't necessarily like the government that was in power at the time. The Sandinistas that are in Nicaragua are trying to house over 1 million people. I think it's like 900,000, nearly 1 million people, 900,000 people. They're trying to get people into homes. They are working for the benefit of the poor and the 99%, you could say. The capitalist class doesn't like that, and we're working with the United States to create a certain destabilization and a soft coup in Nicaragua, not to mention this kind of waging a war against the Sandinista government. But Venezuela also. People always like to bring up Venezuela as the hallmark of how socialism has failed and all this other nonsense. Venezuela may have mismanaged funds and everything else, but let's be very clear and honest that there's been economic warfare waged on these countries in similar ways that they were waged on Chile going back in the 1970s. This playbook is for all intents and purposes the same. Let's keep going because this one is going too long. In 1964 election, the CIA directly underwrote more than half of Frey's campaign expenses. It spent more than $2.6 million in support of the election of a Christian Democratic candidate. More sinister was the agency's disinformation campaign, which it later held up as a model for how to do it. The Church Committee reported extensive use was made of the press, radio films, pamphlets, posters, leaflets, direct mailing, paper streamers, and wall paintings. It was a scare campaign which relied heavily on images of Soviet tanks and Cuban firing squads and was directed especially at women. The CIA placed radio spots that featured the sounds of machine guns followed by a woman's cry, "They have killed my child, the communists!" One poster printed in thousands shows children with hammers and sickles stamped on their foreheads. Juanita Castro, Fidel's anti-communist sister, said on the radio, "If the Reds win in Chile, no type of religious activity will be possible. Chilean mothers, I know you will not allow your children to be taken from you and sent to the communist bloc," as in the case of Cuba. The CIA was running a scare campaign in Chile to prevent Allende from taking power. Now, here's the catch. They failed in this. In fact, they overplayed their hand at one point. This goes on, but let me get to the note. All right, so for months, all right, right here. In an attempt to prevent this, the Nixon White House and the CIA sprang into action. On October 16, 1970, CIA headquarters dispatched a secret eyes-only cable to Henry Hexter, the CIA Santiago station chief. The actual sender, presumably Helms, is blacked out of the text. It is firm and continuous policy that Allende must be overthrown by a coup. It would be much preferable to have this transpire prior to October 24th, but efforts in this regard will continue vigorously beyond this date. We are to continue to generate maximum pressure towards this end, utilizing every appropriate resource. It is imperative that the actions be implemented clandestinely and securely so that the USG, United States government, and Americans' hand will be well hidden. Clandestine operations to essentially overthrow the leader of another country. For months, the CIA had been sounding out senior Chilean military officers on the issue of a coup, promising extensive help to any who agreed to participate. The agency operatives soon discovered that the main obstacle was the commander-in-chief of the army, General Rene Schneider, who represented what the CIA called an apolitical, constitution-oriented inertia of the Chilean military. Essentially, he was an honest guy. Therefore, the CIA set out to find and arm dissident Chilean forces who would assassinate him. One group it approached asked for submachine guns, ammunition, $500,000 or $50,000 to do the job, and the agency obliged, shipping the weapons from Washington to Santiago in a regular diplomatic pouch. Local CIA agents then delivered them to the plotters at 2 a.m. on October 22, 1970. At 8 a.m., the assassins surrounded General Schneider's chauffeur-driven car, knocked out the rear window, and fatally wounded him. He died in a hospital 3 days later. The CIA went to great lengths to cover its tracks, including paying hush money to the conspirators and driving to a general's home to retrieve the guns they had given him. Colonel Paul Wilmert, the military attaché in the United States Embassy in Santiago, had a pistol whipped the general to force him to comply. The agency then dumped the machine guns in the oceans to ensure that they could not be tracked back to the United States government. It's amazing. But Washington and the CIA had overplayed their hands. All right, let's keep going. Right here. The Chilean military... But Washington and the CIA had overplayed their hands. Far from fostering a coup climate, Peter Kornbluh, the chief Chilean specialist at the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C., writes, the Schneider shooting produced an overwhelming public and political repudiation of the violence and clear reaffirmation of the Chilean civil's constitutional tradition. The Chilean Congress voted 153 to 57 to ratify Allende as the president, with all 74 senators and congressmen from the Christian Democratic Party voting with Allende's own party. This result did not, however, even begin to slow down Washington's venomous campaign. For the next 3 years, the Nixon administration tried in every way to undermine Allende by producing economic chaos in Chile, and the CIA worked tirelessly to find suitable generals to put in power. They finally identified a likely candidate in the summer of 1971. The cruel, ruthless, and corrupt Augusto Pinochet. The Chilean military under Pinochet finally moved against Allende on September 11, 1973. During the attack of La Monda, the presidential palace, Pinochet forces ordered Allende an airplane to fly him and his family into exile. Pinochet was taped giving radio instructions to his troops in which he says, the plane will never land. Allende apparently took his own life rather than agreeing to any offer or allowing himself to be captured. He was found dead of a gunshot wound in his office around 2 p.m. on September 11th. Thus began Pinochet's 17-year dictatorship and reign of terror sponsored and paid for by the United States government. During this period, the Chilean military was responsible for the murder, disappearance, death by torture of some 3,197 citizens, according to the post-dictatorship report of the Chilean National Congress Commission on Truth and Reconciliation, released in 1991. In November 2004, the National Commission on Political Imprisonment and Torture, chaired by Monsignor Sergio Villay, published a 1,200-page report that documented more than 27,000 confirmed cases of political imprisonment and the most grotesque forms of torture. Pinochet's major instrument of oppression was the Army's Directorate of National Intelligence, the DINA, headed by Colonel Manuel Contreras. This was us. This was us. It is difficult to read this book, if I'm being honest, because I read this book with, I say whites don't regard their history honestly, but fact is, I'm also an American citizen. And as an American citizen, to some degree, this blood is on my hands because they're doing this stuff in our name. I can say that as an African American, my experience here is somewhat different. I can say that as an African American, we've been under the boot of this country in the same way that that boot has been used on various people around the globe. All of that's true, but by the same token, here I am. This is Chalmers Johnson's Nemesis. It is a necessary read. It is imperative that people understand what our government has done from the standpoint of other nations, because it is hard to have a context on now without understanding what took place then. The same thing that's taken place in Venezuela and Nicaragua is the same thing that we went after Chile and Cuba, using the same sort of techniques and tactics. If you're looking at the world with fresh eyes, you may not necessarily know that, but it is crucial to understand that. It's vital and it's crucial to understand that. I don't think anybody's going to watch this, and I don't think anybody's going to be here this early. Let's see, who's here? Okay, nobody's talking about this. Look, this book is awesome. Chalmers Johnson, Nemesis, and his other book, Blowback. This is just a section of it. Joe Sass. 100% wrong, Jamal. I'm watching. Oh, fair enough. Thank you, Joe. That was admitted quietly. Let's see. 50 people are watching. 1 p.m. in Denmark. It's 11 a.m. in Portugal.
Actually, it's noon.
Joel Chas. Good morning. Good morning back at you, Joel. Good morning back at you. It is when you see people and these guys come across as affable, you must understand, regardless of how they come across as affable, they are doing horrendous things. And the things that they're doing didn't just start today. These things have been going back for the 20s, the 1800s. It has been since the inception of this country where we have been doing bad and horrible things. I am bothered magnificently that there is this weird bias in this country where we can, with a straight face, say that, oh my God, there were Facebook and Twitter ads, while at the same token, from the inception of this country, we've been undermining, destroying, torturing, putting in puppet regimes all throughout the world. This book is awesome. Chalmers Johnson, Nemesis. I want to read other passages from this book. I think it's going to have to be shorter passages because this has gone like 30 minutes. But I'll try to find a better way to get the information out, maybe in shorter spurts. Amazing book. Johnson just has a way of weaving this stuff together. Mainly his argument was more so against empire and what we've done in pursuit of empire, and how that is essentially hollowing us out as a country. But he's giving a historical context to this that is imperative to understand. So, Emerald Ordi, it is grim and sad. Also, good evening from Melbourne. Iman Ormandi, thank you very much. And good evening from Portugal, or good morning from Portugal. Good morning from Portugal. Jay Scott, not picking a fight, but you can't say that Facebook and Twitter ads are meaningless and then say social media is important, 70% of news sources. Meaningless is too strong. My argument is more so, it is... In the election of George Bush, hundreds of thousands of African Americans weren't allowed to vote in Florida. In the election of Donald Trump, if you want to get into the details of it, again, thousands of African Americans and many other people of either Asian descent weren't allowed to vote in various states because they were being knocked off the rolls through either this Operation Cross-Check nonsense that the Republicans are pushing out in order to push people off the rolls, this specter of voter fraud. Even if you want to go with this idea of cutting down the number of polling locations to limit the number of people that are voting. My point is, there are more things that assail your world than this. And the idea that the Russian... You would have to make a case to me, and you have to show that those ads had some effect on the election. And the problem is that those ads were stuff that people were already saying. If somebody was taking point of Clinton dealing with global warming or dealing with climate stuff, that has nothing to do with the Russians. Hillary Clinton not going to Wisconsin has nothing to do with the Russians. Bill Clinton passing election reform, cheating Sanders, none of these things have anything to do with the Russians. It's nonsense. It's an excuse that they're using in order to hide the fact that she just lost. She just lost. Get over it. Your candidate lost. The person you voted for lost. She completely, magnificently lost. She ran the election as if people were owed their vote. As people owed Hillary Clinton their vote. Yeah, I'm sorry. Your candidate just lost. It's embarrassing. She lost a reality show host. Get over it. Get over it. It is true that 70% of the media, or 70% of news is consumed through social media. But that is not the same thing as saying that people are looking at certain ads and those ads are completely influencing their opinion. Yeah, you have to show a thing, and there's been no correlation showing that that's true. It's just what they've been using. If a black person is shot by a cop, that has nothing to do with Russia. It has everything to do with the cop shooting that black person. If I say, oh my God, there's a hair on fire report that the UN put out talking about climate change, and that the Democratic Party or the candidate that the Democratic Party is pushing out is selling fracking around the world, that has nothing to do with the Russians. You can go down the list on this stuff. The Democratic Party is trying to use the specter of Russians in the same way that the Republican Party is trying to use the specter of immigrants. No. The issues of your country are the issues in your country, and it's not external to your country. Let's be very clear. Let's be very clear. They would never get over it. They're pissed that a white man got the last word. It has nothing to do with his race. Women and minorities in America the past 50 years have been conditioned to think that they always get the last word on white men. You are insane. Skip, you are you're on drugs. If you honestly believe that, you're on drugs. You're completely on drugs. This has nothing to do with Donald Trump being white. It has everything to do with her just losing and people who supported her not being able to deal with the fact that she lost. The bitter enders, if you want to call them that. The bitter enders for Hillary. Yeah, the bitter enders for Hillary. Just call them racist and they lose their jobs. Skip, this is not about Donald Trump being white. It's about Donald Trump winning. There's a difference in those things. Donald Trump, you're looking at this through the lens of race, which is a nonsense way to look at this through that lens. There are ways that you could look at this election. You could say that there was a certain degree of white rage. You could say that there was white rage. You could say that there's a break in the parties where, minorities and so forth go towards Democrats and whites go towards Republicans. You could say that there's a block of voters that used to belong to Democrats that ended up in. There are ways that you can break this from the standpoint of race. But in this very specific case, they just lost. They just lost. Yeah, they just lost. I don't understand how you even look at it through that. They're like that way. I don't even know where you get that from. And it's not. If Donald Trump was Nikki Haley, let's say Donald Trump was Nikki Haley. Let's say Donald Trump wasn't white. Let's say Donald Trump was Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley, for all intents and purposes, would espouse the exact same viewpoints that Donald Trump is espousing. She would probably be more hawkish in some of these situations. If that was Nikki Haley, you honestly believe, I'm trying to get across to you that this has less to do with, at least from the standpoint of the people supporting or pissed off, has less to do with race as opposed to him just losing or Clinton just losing. I'm saying that the pussy hat wearers are pissed the white man won. Yes, the pussy hat wearers are pissed that the white man won. That's true. That part's true. I agree with that. But for the pussy hat wearers. Only for the pussy hat wearers. All right. I need to end this. Jay, I understand your point, dude. If 70% of media is social media, the problem with that argument is that the arguments that were being made by Russians are the arguments that were being made by other people. It wasn't these different, wildly expansive arguments. And the arguments was being made on both sides to create division. Even in the report that was put out where they indicted that woman or they charged that woman, it wasn't for one side or the other. It was for both. They was looking to sow discord in general, at least based on their own, based on that, if you go with that idea that what was taking place. But that wasn't for Trump. That needs to be very clear. Even in their own thing, that wasn't for Trump. That was discord for both. So, just saying. All right. Booyah, scored a point. Yes, you scored a point. I agree with you on that one. The pussy hat wearers wanted. I'll give you another point, Skip. There's been a weird phenomena where race would be like where I remember I listened to somebody and it was like, you're just a white man. And they're using that as a pejorative. God, that's so divisive. That's so divisive. Whites make up what, like 60% of the population? My goal is not to divide. My goal and my main argument is that for all intents and purposes, we, the 99%, if we do the labor, we should get the economic benefits of the labor. And that is not necessarily an argument that's necessarily based on race. That's an argument based on this kind of economic thing. I don't like the divisiveness that's put out in this level of racial politics. I don't like it whether it's from the Republican Party, which, mind you, it does come from the Republican Party. Also, you can make an argument it started to some degree with the Republican Party. That's not true. That's not fully true. That's not fully true. Look at this. Just to make the point, Skip, please tell me you don't support stuff like this. Or at the very least, you acknowledge, if I can find it, right here. Miami GOP chairman just caught leading Proud Boy attack in the Democratic campaign office. Essentially, a GOP representative leads a racist attack, or leads an attack with a racist group on a Democratic campaign office, leveraging the energy in the same way that the Tea Party was leveraged by the Republican Party to use as a weapon against the Democratic Party. Please tell me you don't agree with this, Skip. That is not a level of politics that we need to be involved in. Look, I think that a lot of this boils down to there's been an economic break within the country itself where people's lives have gotten harder. And when people's lives are getting harder, it's kind of like if you throw a crumb of bread to a bunch of birds, that the birds will peck each other to try to get to the bread and fight each other for it. 95% of the wealth going to the top 1%. And you have a situation where wages have, for the most part, been stagnant, even though bills and everything else have gone up. So healthcare costs has gone up, college costs has gone up, lives have gotten harder. And then lives are getting harder, there's more stress that's put onto the population itself. That stress exerts itself in ways that don't necessarily always correlate directly to. We assume and we act as if people make individual decisions, as if the environment and the society that the people are in are not necessarily indicative of the individual's decision. Skip Rock just said Proud Boys are mostly black. Proud Boys are not mostly. Skip, some of them are of different races, yes. Mostly black is a little strong. Mostly black is a little strong. Let's be honest, Skip. Let's come to Jesus, Skip. Let's come to Jesus. Let's come to Jesus. The Proud Boys are not mostly black. They're not mostly black. It is a lie. Yes, it's not true. Jay Scott is right. That is not true, Skip. All right. I don't like the division. This world doesn't have to be this way. We can have a different society and we can have a different world. In the same way that other countries provide health care for each other, in the same way they provide education for each other, in the same way they provide child credits. The goal of life should not necessarily be to try to make life as difficult as it is for people. And fact is, the political parties that were supposed to be there are not representative of what the public wants. In that you have anger against the political institutions, particularly against the Democratic Party, because that's the party that's supposed to be the feel your pain party. This is going off the rails. This is going off the rails. Israel has an influence in all parts of our system, but how big is debatable. Israel does have influence in our system, in our political system. I think that's just honest. I mean, come on. How can you not look at our political system and say they don't have influence? Look at what Donald Trump has been doing. He's been arm in arm with Benjamin Netanyahu in Saudi Arabia, and both of those forces are somewhat similar because they're both aligned against Iran. Yes, they have a massive influence on U.S. policy. We just allowed Jerusalem to be move the embassy to Jerusalem, something that none of the U.S. presidents would do, even though many of the other presidents would give voice to. None of them would actually do, because that's contested territory. The question is, how much? Is it the tail wagging the dog, or the vice versa? That's always in question. Trump is the swamp. Trump is a symptom of the swamp. He's not the swamp in and of itself. Dewey Bueno. The monetary system is on its last leg. It's propped up. Interest rates went up to keep the dollar from going to zero. Some countries are dropping the dollar. And if the dollar is lost from the reserve currency, all hell is going to break loose. That is Zionism more than is Israel. They're tied and kidney, but Zionism is the cancer, not Israel itself. Yes and no. Yes and no. Like, I have no issue with the existence of Israel. My issue is more so that, look, the people are perfectly nice, the people that you interact with and everything else, and it's an odd place to be in, because you intuitively know that when you see those guys going out with guns, those guys are going out with guns because they're stolen someone's land, and those people want their land back, in which case you need to fight the people who are trying to get their land back. But at the same token, the other people are perfectly pleasant. The issue has to do with the theft of land, the murdering of other human beings in the pursuit of taking that land. In fact is, we've not been fair arbiters in this process, and we've made this process worse. You can make a case that the existence of Israel itself is colonialism, which I've made the case before. And in being a colonial project, is if we were looking at America colonize the Native American population, it would look a lot like what's taking place in Israel right now, if media was covering it back then. We don't have historical context, so we look at this as something different, not to mention the media gives a different portrayal here in the United States as opposed to reality. But yes, there's a difference between Zionism and Israel. There's a difference. God, I want the conflict to end. I want that fucking conflict to end. It's just been going on for fucking ever. It's not a religious conflict. The conflict is about land. You're stealing other people's land. All right, I'm going to end this because I need to go. All right, guys. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through Patreon. Israel is the only country that has used a god as their real estate agent, nobody else. Yeah, and that's a bizarre thing. The whole Jewish apartheid state thing is also weird. What's wrong with stealing other people's land? Yeah, I know, right? I know. A colonial project. All right, guys, I'm going to end this here. This started off talking about Chalmers Johnson's book, Nemesis, and this went into fuckery as it typically does. Look, I have people who are Trump supporters. I have people who are Clinton supporters. And I honestly do appreciate both, if that makes sense, even though they vehemently disagree. If both of them are on my channel, it means that to some degree, there's something that I'm saying that they either agree with, or at the very least, they're in an orbit, which means that we're not as far apart as it's portrayed. There's a way to bridge the gap. And we need to figure out what that is. Otherwise, we're going to tear ourselves apart. I'll leave it here. I think the political space and the political instrument has gotten to the point where, well, I need to go. So I'm going to end this here. All right, guys. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through Patreon. think so. All right.